Her heart twisted in her chest, but she didn't pull away. She couldn't. Her mind was swirling, filled with the countless questions that she had buried deep inside. Could she live with this? Could she live with the knowledge that she had given herself away, not just for survival, but for a fleeting moment of hope? Her thoughts turned back to Olamide. Her brother, his feverish body, his weak, desperate cries for help. Is it worth it? She wondered. Is saving him worth losing myself? The billionaire stepped back, allowing her to breathe again, though the suffocating weight of the moment remained. He studied her silently, his eyes colder now, like two stones carved from ice. I know you're scared, he said, his voice softer, as if he were speaking to a child. But you must understand, there are no second chances. Once you've crossed this line, there's no way back. Not for you, not for anyone. Aduni nodded, though her heart felt like it was cracking inside her chest. She had already crossed that line. She had stepped into a world where the rules no longer applied, where survival was bought and paid for with the currency of one's soul. And now, as the night pressed on, she wondered what was left of her. The billionaire turned away from her, his back to her as he gazed out the window at the darkness beyond. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, as though the whole ordeal was nothing more than a passing inconvenience. His life, it seemed, was built on the suffering of other Zan deals, like the one they had just made. Aduni looked at him, at the man who had bargained with her in the most despicable of ways, and felt the coldness settle deeper into her bones. She was not just a pawn in his game. She was a tool, a means to an end. Her body was a commodity, her choices a currency he had used to secure the life of her brother. And yet, in that moment, something shifted within her. The faintest spark of defiance, buried deep beneath the weight of the night, began to glow. She had come here to save Olamide. She had made this choice for him, but she refused to let this man, this billionaire, take everything from her. He had taken enough already. Aduni took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wouldn't let him see the fear, the doubt, the weakness that had nearly consumed her. She was stronger than that. Se at Tobi. When the billionaire finally turned to face her again, his eyes narrowed, as though he had sensed the shift in her. But he said nothing. Instead, he moved toward the door, his every step measured, deliberate. You should rest, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Tomorrow, you'll leave. Your brother will be fine. But for now, you should sleep. You'll need your strength. Aduni didn't respond. She didn't want to say anything that might reveal how broken she felt, how shattered by the weight of the night's choices. She watched as he opened the door, his figure disappearing into the hallway beyond, leaving her alone in the room, alone, with nothing but the oppressive silence and the suffocating weight of what she had just agreed to. The door clicked shut behind him, and the room felt even colder, as though he had taken all the warmth with him. Aduni stood there for a long time, her mind spinning in circles, each thought chasing the other, but no answers coming. She turned toward the window, staring at the dark sky outside. The stars were hidden behind thick clouds, and the moon was barely visible, as though even the heavens were retreating from what had transpired in this room. What have I done? The question echoed in her mind, louder than any of the others, and she could feel the tears building in the corners of her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. She had chosen this. She had made the decision for Olamide, for his life. But at what cost? She thought of the village, of the people who had known her, who had watched her grow up, who had seen her as someone strong, someone capable. Could they ever look at her the same way again? Would they understand? Would they forgive her for the price she had paid? Aduni closed her eyes, breathing in deeply, trying to steady the storm inside her. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to think about the future. The morning would come, Olamide would live, she would go back to the village, and the world would continue. But in the quiet of that moment, in the cold emptiness of the room, she wondered if anything would ever be the same again. She opened her eyes, looking out the window once more. The night seemed to stretch on forever, like a river with no end. The darkness was all around her, swallowing everything whole, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of her decision. Was it worth it? The question hung in the air, unanswered, and she knew, in the depths of her soul, that she would never have the answer. Morning came without birdsong. In Aduni's village, dawn usually arrived on the wings of sound the prow crowing of roosters, the gossip of weaver birds, the distant thud of pestles pounding young. But on this day, the air over the compound lay still, as if even the sun were unsure whether it should rise. The earth smelled damp and uneasy, like soil turned before a burial, and in the small hut at the edge of the village, Olamide stopped breathing. It was Mama Iya, who felt it first. She had been sitting beside the boy through the final hours of night, her old fingers resting lightly on his wrist, counting the weak rhythm of his pulse, the way one counts the last drops of water in a calabash. When the rhythm faltered and faded, she did not cry out. She only closed her eyes and whispered to the ancestors, for there are some battles herbs cannot win, and some bargain spirits refuse to honor. A proverb says that when a child dies, the village loses a future. That morning, the village lost one quietly. By the time the first light stretched across the sky, the news had begun to move like smoke. Women carrying water pots slowed their steps. Men on their way to the farms paused beneath the udala trees. Whispers passed from mouth to mouth, heavy and disbelieving. But the sister went to the city, someone said. They said the rich man promised help. Another answered, money can buy many things, but it cannot command the breath of God. Mama Iya covered Alimidi's body with a white cloth. His face, once tight with fever, now lay calm and strangely distant, as if he had already begun walking a road none of them could see. She rose slowly, her knees protesting like old doors, and stepped outside. The sky had finally decided to brighten, but the light felt thin, uncertain. She looked toward the road that led to the city and sighed, because she knew the hardest part was yet to come. Far away, behind high walls and iron gates, Aduni was also watching the morning arrive. The mansion's curtains were half drawn, allowing pale sunlight to spill across the polished floor like diluted milk. She had not slept. Sleep does not visit those who wrestle with their own reflection. She sat at the edge of the great bed, her back straight, her eyes dry, feeling as if the night had peeled away her skin and left her standing raw before the world. A soft knock came at the door. The elegant woman entered first, her face composed in that careful way of people who serve power but do not own it. Behind her stood the billionaire, already dressed, already distant. He did not look like a man who had passed through a storm. He looked like a man preparing for a meeting. "It is done," he said simply. His voice was smooth, as though the night had been nothing more than a signed document placed in a drawer. Arrangements had been made. The best doctors were sent before dawn. Your brother will receive care beyond what your village could imagine. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve and added, "You will be taken home now." Aduni rose slowly. Her legs felt unfamiliar beneath her, like borrowed limbs. She searched his face for something, a crack, a tremor, a sign that he understood what this night had cost. Herbert found only the calm surface of a man accustomed to transactions. A person who buys goats does not ask the goat how it feels about the rope. "Thank you," she said, though the words tasted like ash. Gratitude and grief wrestled inside her chest, neither strong enough to win. She had given what she promised. Now she would return to see her brother alive. She told herself. She would endure. The whispers, the stares, the silent judgments. She would endure anything, because Olamide would live. The journey back felt shorter, or perhaps it was simply that she no longer measured distance the same way. The city thinned into highways, the highways into dusty roads, and the dusty roads into the narrow path that led to her village. The driver did not speak. The world outside the window moved in ordinary rhythms, children walking, traders arranging wares, smoke rising from cooking fire, soon aware that her life had split into a before and an after. As the car approached the village, she noticed something strange. No children ran alongside it. No curious faces gathered. The air felt thick, watchful. Even the dogs did not bark. A proverb says that when the drumbeat changes, even the deaf will sense it in their bones. Something had changed. The car stopped at the edge of the compound. Aduni stepped out, her feet touching the red earth she had known since childhood. For a brief moment, relief washed over her. She was home. She had survived. She lifted her eyes toward the hut, expecting to see Mama Yaya waiting with news of Alamide's recovery. Instead, she saw a white cloth. It hung over the doorway like a silent announcement. Women sat on low stools, the wrappers pulled over their heads. Men stood in small clusters, speaking in low tones that died when they saw her. The silence that followed her steps was heavier than any accusation. Mama Ia walked toward her slowly. The old woman's eyes held no judgment, only a sorrow so deep it seemed to belong to the earth itself. She reached out and took Aduni's hands, and in that touch, Aduni felt the truth before she heard it. Some news does not need words. It travels through skin. "Child," Mama Ia said softly. The river chose its own path. Aduni stared at her, the world tilting. "No," she whispered, shaking her head as if she could scatter the meaning like dust. He was to be healed. He was to live. Her voice grew sharper, desperate. "He promised." Mama Ia's grip tightened. "Money can summon doctors," she said, "but it cannot command destiny." Olamide walked with the ancestors before the sun rose. The words fell between them like a broken pot. For a long moment, Aduni did not move. The sacrifice, the contract, the night that had carved her open, all of it flashed before her in a blinding rush. She had given everything, and still the river had taken her brother. A sound rose from her throat then, not quite a scream, not quite a sob. It was the sound of something breaking beyond repair. And as the villagers watched, unsure whether to comfort or condemn, one question settled over them all, like dust after Harmattan. If the price had been paid and the promise broken, who would answer for it? The earth seemed to tremble beneath Aduni's feet as the weight of the truth settled around her. The words "Olamide is gone" echoed in her mind, louder than the shuffling of feet and the quiet sobs of the village women. Gone, the price she had paid for his life, the contract she had signed, the night she had given up her very soul of it, had been for nothing. The empty space that had once been her brother was now filled with the silence of her own failure. Mama Ia held onto her hands with a strength that belied her age, pulling Aduni into an embrace that was more of a shelter than comfort. The old woman did not speak, for there was nothing left to say. The villagers had already begun to gather in small, hushed groups, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. Some looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. Others stood with their heads bowed in reverence, as if they could understand her pain better from a distance. Aduni felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath her. She had crossed a line, treaded a part of herself that could never be recovered, but in the end, it had meant nothing. Nothing. The billionaire's promises were empty, and now her brother was gone. But in the midst of her grief, a fire began to stir within her. It was a small, quiet flame at first, but it grew, fanning into something that burned hot and fierce in the pit of her stomach. "No," she thought, her heart tightening. "This cannot be the end." She pulled away from Mama Ia's embrace, her face a mask of grief and fury. The old woman's eyes held a deep understanding, but she said nothing. She did not need to. Mama Ia had seen the cost of survival too many times to count. Aduni wiped her eyes and stood tall, gathering the strength to face what came next. The village was still waiting, watching her every move, but she did not care about their eyes, their whispers, their judgment. She would not let this be her end. She would not let this betrayal go unanswered. "I will go to him," she said, her voice hoarse but resolute. "I will make him pay for this." The people of the village began to murmur, as though afraid of the words that hung in the air. "P.A.!" What did she mean by that? The price had been paid, hadn't it? Wasn't the night a transaction? Wasn't her soul already forfeit? But Aduni had not yet spoken the full truth, and they did not know the depth of her resolve. Mama Ia placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Aduni, ciao," she began softly. "Some debts cannot be repaid with fury. Some rivers cannot be swum twice." But Aduni shook her head fiercely, her eyes flashing with a fire that had not been there moments before. "I will make him answer for this," she repeated, her voice growing stronger. "I will make him understand that he cannot treat people like things to be used and discarded. I will go to him, and I will take back what is mine." Mama Ia said nothing, but there was a sadness in her eyes, as though she understood exactly what Aduni meant. And though the old woman's words were wise, Aduni knew that the river she had stepped into was already pulling her downstream, and she could no longer resist its current. The village stood in stunned silence as she turned away, her steps firm and unwavering. She knew they were watching her, but she did not care. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, she had a purpose, a mission. She would not let Alamide's death be in vain. She would not allow the billionaire to think he could buy her brother's life and leave her broken. The journey back to the city felt different now. The road was no longer just a path home. It was a road that would lead her to justice, to something far more important than survival. This time, Aduni was not just a woman walking toward her past. She was walking toward her future, toward a reckoning. When she arrived at the mansion, she did not pause at the gates or knock politely at the door. She did not ask for permission. She stormed past the guards, her eyes fierce, her heart full of fire. She was no longer the woman who had signed away her dignity for a chance at survival. She was a woman with nothing left to lose. And when you have nothing, there is nothing that can break you. The guards tried to stop her, but she pushed past them, her strength fueled by anger and pain. She made her way to the grand entryway, her every step steady and sure. Inside, the billionaire was sitting at his desk, as though nothing had changed. He looked up at her as she entered, his expression unreadable, as though her presence was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Aduni," he said, his voice cool, almost bored. "I thought you would have been gone by now. I have fulfilled my part of the bargain. Your brother is gone, and you are free to return to your life." But Aduni was no longer the woman who had signed that contract. The woman who had stood there, trembling and unsure, had died with a lie. She was someone new now, someone with the strength of loss, someone who had been burned by the fires of betrayal. "You promised me my brother's life," she said, her voice hard as stone. "And yet you took him from me anyway. You think you can just walk away from this? That I will simply forget what you've done? But you are wrong." The billionaire raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "What do you intend to do, Aduni? You think you can change what's already been done?" Aduni's eyes blazed with a fury he had never seen before. "I don't need to change it. I'm here to make you understand what you did. You will never walk away from this, and I will make sure of it." For the first time, the billionaire's mask of indifference faltered. There was a flicker of something behind his eyes, something like uncertainty. But it was too late. Aduni had already crossed a line, and now the game had changed. The fire that had been kindled in her chest now burned hot enough to melt the walls around her. She would make him pay. She would make the price of her brother's life known to the world. She would burn his world to the ground if it meant no one else would ever be treated like a commodity again. The billionaire's smug expression didn't waver as Aduni stood before him, her chest rising and falling with each breath, her heart a drumbeat in the silence that stretched between them. She was no longer the woman who had signed that cursed contract. She was no longer the desperate sister pleading for her brother's life. Now, she was a force, a storm that had gathered all its rage and grief into something far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. For the first time since their meeting, he seemed to truly see her. It was as if the veil of indifference he had worn so comfortably had slipped. Hustalitli. In his eyes, there was something flickering, maybe a hint of fear, or perhaps just a recognition of the weight of her words. Aduni stepped closer, her presence commanding. "You think you can buy lives, Mr. Maxwell?" she asked, her voice low but full of a cold, unyielding power. "You think you can take a child's life and leave the mother to mourn in silence? Do you think you can steal from us and not pay the price?" His gaze remained unflinching, but something in the air had shifted. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. His face remained unreadable, but his posture, once relaxed and aloof, now suggested something more guarded. Perhaps he was beginning to realize that Aduni was not the same woman who had walked into his office with hopes for a simple transaction. "You don't understand the game you're playing, Aduni," he said, his tone clipped, as though he were explaining something to a child. "This is how the world works. It always has. You needed something. Primera provid ed italiano. There's no debt here, there is no betrayal. It was a business arrangement." "A business arrangement," she echoed, her voice rising. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in on her as she stepped closer, the anger inside her starting to bubble to the surface. "You took a life for money, Maxwell. You used me. You took my brother's life, and you think you can simply dismiss it as a transaction." For the first time, the billionaire faltered. He opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off, her words sharper than any blade. "You don't get to walk away from this. Not after everything you've done." Her voice cracked with raw emotion, the dam she had kept inside for so long beginning to break. "You promised me my brother's life in exchange for mine. But that was a lie. You didn't just take my dignity, my body, my soul. You took my brother from me, and I will make sure you answer for it." She was no longer looking at the man sitting in front of her. She was looking beyond him, at the system, at the world that had allowed this to happen, at the forces that had twisted her into a pawn in their game. She saw the years of exploitation, the rich men who took from the poor, the powerful who preyed on the weak. She saw herself, and every woman who had ever been forced to choose between survival and dignity. She was not just fighting for her brother anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced. Maxwell studied her, and for the first time there was no smug superiority in his gaze. There was something else, something like curiosity, like he was watching a creature he didn't fully understand. He leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "You think you can challenge me?" His voice was quieter now, more controlled, but there was still an edge to it. "You think the world will listen to your grief? That your pain will mean anything to me?" Aduni didn't flinch. She had nothing left to lose. "I don't care what you think," she said, her voice steady, despite the storm brewing within her. "But you'll care when the world knows who you are. You'll care when everyone knows what you did." Maxwell's eyes narrowed as he stood slowly, the weight of his presence filling the room. He was taller than her, his figure imposing, but Aduni held her ground. There was a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes, a recognition of the threat she now posed. "You're making a mistake, Aduni," he warned, his voice low. "You think you can break me with your anger, your accusations. You think you can take me down with your little speeches? This is how the world works, and you can't change that." Aduni's eyes burned with the fire of everything she had lost. "You're right," she said, her voice softening for a moment. "I can't change the world, but I can change how it remembers you." The billionaire took a step forward, his presence pressing down on her like a physical weight, but Aduni did not retreat. Her resolve was stronger than any fear he could instill in her. "You want to make me pay?" he asked, his voice a dark threat now. "How will you do that, Aduni? What will you do when you've lost everything? Everything." She laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. "I already lost everything. But you haven't lost enough yet. Not until you see the truth of what you've done. Not until you understand what it means to be powerless." There was a long pause, and for a moment it seemed as if the billionaire might strike, might silence her with the weight of his wealth and power. But instead, he simply looked at her, his lips curling into the smallest of smiles. "You've made your choice," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "And you will live with it, just as I will live with mine." Aduni didn't respond. She didn't need to. The room was thick with the understanding that nothing was settled, that this was far from over. The battle had only just begun, and she would not rest until Maxwell paid for what he had done. She turned and walked out of the room, her steps steady, her heart still beating with the fire of determination. The mansion, once a symbol of her defeat, now stood as a monument to her resolve, and as she stepped into the bright daylight, a new strength blossomed within her. She was no longer just a sister seeking justice. She was a woman on a mission to bring down the man who had taken everything from her, and she would not stop until he had paid the price. The air was thick as Aduni made her way down the mansion's steps, her mind racing faster than her feet could carry her. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched out like fingers, but it offered no warmth. The weight of what had just transpired felt like an iron collar around her neck, tightening with every step she took away from the mansion. She had confronted him, spoken the truth she had kept buried for so long. Yet, in the end, nothing had changed. The billionaire still held all the power. But not for long, she thought, her teeth clenching. Her eyes, red from lack of sleep, were sharp with the fire of determination. No, she was not done. Not by a long shot. She had come here to get justice for Olamide, and though the night had been brutal, it had also been an awakening. She had seen the truth of the world. She was living in one where lives were traded like cattle, where power was the currency, and where people like her were nothing more than pawns in the hands of those who had too much to lose. And for the first time, she had a choice that no one else had given her, but one that she could seize. The world had stripped her of everything: her dignity, her innocence, her brother, but it had not taken her voice, and as long as she had her voice, she would fight. The driver, who had once been a mere figure of the journey's beginnings, now seemed to have taken on a new significance. His quiet presence felt like an anchor. As she approached the car, he opened the door for her, his eyes flicking briefly to her tense posture before looking away. "Are you sure you want to return, Miss?" he asked cautiously, sensing something had shifted in her. Aduni paused, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of the car door. The city, with all its promises of wealth and escape, seemed so far away now. In that moment it felt more like a prison than a sanctuary, but she had made her choice, and there was no going back. "I'm not going back," she replied firmly. "Take me to the nearest media house." The driver's eyes widened, his brows knitting together as he hesitated. "Miss... what exactly do you intend to do?" "I intend to make the world see what he is," she said, her voice cold, her tone sharp as an arrow. "I'll make sure the truth doesn't stay buried in the dark." The journey was long, and the streets of the city seemed to mock her with their relentless, unfeeling pace. People moved about their lives, heads down, lost in the humdrum of the everyday. But she saw none of it. Her mind was elsewhere, preparing for the storm she was about to unleash. As they neared the media house, the weight of her decision settled in her bones. The world she was about to expose wasn't just a reflection of Maxwell's greed. It was the reflection of everything she had been taught to accept: an unjust world, where the rich and powerful controlled the lives of those who had nothing. When the car finally stopped outside the building, she was no longer sure of what she would find. But there was no room for doubt now. She could either walk away and let Maxwell's influence swallow her forever, or she could fight with everything she had. She stepped out of the car, her movements quick and purposeful. The security guards at the entrance tried to stop her, but she knew how to move through spaces like this. She had seen it before: how the rich protect their own, how the system shuts out those who dare to disrupt it. But she was not afraid. "I need to speak to someone in charge," said old Tim, her voice unwavering. The guards exchanged wary glances, but one of them, a tall man with a thick accent, stepped forward. "And why would you want to speak to someone here?" Aduni straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze head-on. "Because I have a story that will change everything, and the world needs to hear it." The guard hesitated for a moment, then nodded curtly, signaling for her to follow him inside. The lobby was sleek and modern, filled with glass walls and cold steel surfaces, all designed to make the building look as imposing as possible. Aduni's heart pounded, but she did not falter. She had walked through far worse, through the silence of a village that had turned its back on her, through the night where she had lost herself. This was nothing. They led her up to a small office on the third floor, where a woman in her early 30s sat behind a desk, typing furiously. Ari's dignity even flicker when Aduni entered, as though she were just another person passing through. But when she looked up, there was something in her gaze that made Aduni pause. A curiosity, a recognition of someone who had come here with purpose. "How can I help you?" the woman asked, not unkindly, but with a detached professionalism that suggested she had seen too many people walk in and out of this building with their desperate stories. Aduni's eyes never left hers. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice clear, strong. "I have a story about a billionaire," she said. "A man who thinks he can buy lives, and I have the proof that can bring him down." The woman raised an eyebrow, as though she had heard it all before. "What makes you think we'd be interested in another scandal?" Aduni stepped forward, her hands gripping the edges of the desk. "Because this isn't just a scandal. This is the truth. This man took my brother's life, and I have the evidence to make sure the world knows exactly who he is." For a moment the woman said nothing. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then she leaned back in her chair, regarding Aduni carefully. "Is this "Is this personal?" the woman asked quietly. Aduni nodded. "It's personal, but it's more than that. This man represents everything that's wrong with the world. The people he steps on, the lives he destroys, they all matter." The woman sat up straighter now, her expression shifting. "All right," she said, her tone more serious. "Let's hear it. But you should know, once this goes public, there's no turning back." Aduni did not hesitate. "I'm not looking to go back," she said softly. "I'm looking to make sure that what he's done never happens again." As the woman began to type, preparing for what was to come, Aduni took a deep breath. She had no idea what the fallout would be, or what her life would look like once the story was out in the world. But one thing was certain. She was no longer afraid. The storm had arrived, and she was ready to face it head-on. The city hummed with its usual urgency, the streets swarming with people oblivious to the storm that was gathering on the horizon. For them, it was just another day, just another wave of the endless tide. But for Aduni, every moment felt like the final beat of a drum before war. She had given the world the spark, and now it was up to the world to decide whether it would catch fire. The media house moved quickly. The woman who had taken Aduni's story, whose name, as it turned out, was committed, didn't waste time. She had seen enough scandals to know when something was serious, and Aduni's fire was undeniable. By the time the sun had dipped below the skyline, the first whispers of the story had begun to trickle out. The billionaire was a man who had made his fortune off the suffering of others. That was the story that Kemi had packaged, wrapped in cold facts and undeniable truths. The woman who had come to him desperate for help, her brother's life dangling by a thread, had walked away from the city with far more than just the promise of survival. She had walked away with the scars of a deal that had cost her more than she could ever repay. The story went viral faster than anyone could have predicted. In the age of instant information, a single message can unravel the lives of even the most untouchable. Maxwell's name, once a symbol of power, began to be whispered in corners where it had never been spoken before. People began to dig into his past, the shell companies, the dirty deals, the lives he had ruined on his way to the top. The truth, once hidden in the shadows, was now in the light. Aduni did not rest. She couldn't afford to. The phone in her hand buzzed constantly, Kemi's calls coming through in a steady stream. She didn't answer most of them. There was no need to hear the voices of people she didn't trust. What mattered was that the story was out, and that Maxwell's empire, so carefully constructed, was beginning to shake at its foundations. What she did not expect was how fast the backlash came. The first wave was subtle on attempt to discredit her. Articles appeared with headlines suggesting she was exaggerating, that her version of the events was colored by emotion and anger. There were attempts to paint her as a desperate woman trying to profit off the tragedy of her brother's death. The billionaire's legal team swung into action almost immediately, flooding the airwaves with counter. They smeared her name, questioning her integrity, and made it clear that there was no shortage of resources to ensure that the truth was buried. Aduni expected that. She had known it was coming, but it still hurt. What didn't he expect was the wave of support that rose in response. It started with the people she had left behind in the village. Mothers, fathers, children, all of them who had watched her grow up, who had known her story, and who understood the pain of losing someone they loved. They began to speak out, their voices rising louder, carrying her story to places she had never imagined. In the weeks that followed, people from all walks of life began to demand justice. They shared their own stories of exploitation, of systems that preyed on their vulnerability, of deals made in shadows to keep the powerful in power. They used the hashtag #JusticeForAduni, a rallying cry that spread like wildfire across social media. Maxwell's public image, once polished and untouchable, began to crack. And then, as if to prove the point that nothing in this world comes without a price, the storm came. A high-profile investor pulled out of one of Maxwell's largest projects, citing the toxic publicity surrounding the billionaire's name. Sponsors withdrew their support from his luxury brands, and the companies he had built on the backs of the weak began to see their stock values plummet. The backlash was swift and unforgiving, and it seemed the world had finally turned its eyes toward the truth. But the billionaire wasn't finished. Behind the scenes, Maxwell fought back with a savagery that only the truly powerful can afford. His lawyers filed lawsuits left and right, accusing Aduni of defamation, dragging her name through the mud even more than before. The public attacks against her became sharper, more personnel. They tried to bury her, force her into silence. But Aduni was not so easily silenced. The people who supported her, the ones who had seen their lives echoed in her story, did not back down. Instead, they fought alongside her, calling for accountability, not just for Maxwell, but for the system that allowed people like him to thrive, while others were crushed beneath the weight of their greed. And then, one morning, the final blow fell. A damning piece of evidence emerged, one that neither Maxwell nor his lawyers could deny. It came from an unexpected source, an anonymous whistleblower who had worked within one of Maxwell's companies. A trove of documents surfaced, showing that not only had Maxwell been involved in the exploitation of vulnerable people like Aduni, but he had also orchestrated numerous illegal activities to cover his tracks. The proof was undeniable, and the legal tide shifted dramatically. In a rare public statement, Maxwell tried to spin the situation, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, a series of unfortunate events. But the damage was already done. His power had crumbled. The media, once swayed by his money and influence, now turned their focus squarely on him. Public opinion had shifted. The billionaire's reputation had gone from untouchable to toxic in the span of weeks, and in that storm of publicity, Aduni stood unyielding. She did not care about the wealth or the limelight. She did not care about the victory in the courtrooms or the media frenzy. What always mattered was the truth. And now, the world knew it. She thought of Olamide's smile, the way he would laugh over nothing at all, the way he had fought for life in his final hours, even though she had failed him in the end. His death had been the catalyst, the spark that had ignited something far greater than just a search for justice. It had been the beginning of something that might just change the world. Aduni stood before the mirror in her small apartment, her eyes reflecting the storm that still raged within her. She had won, but the battle was not over. For as long as there was greed in the world, as long as people were willing to sell their souls for power, the fight would continue. And Aduni was ready. The day the news broke, the world seemed to hold its breath. Maxwell, once a titan of industry, stood in the center of the storm he had created, his empire slipping from his grasp as quickly as a shadow dissolves at dawn. But for Aduni, the news was nothing new. She had known for a long time that his kingdom of glass and steel was bound to shatter. What mattered now was the silence that followed. The silence of her brother's grave. The silence of a village still waiting for justice. The silence of the life she had fought for. A life now free of the man who had once held her captive in his web of promises and lies. But even in the silence, there was no peace. Aduni had won, at least in the eyes of the world. Maxwell's arrest made headlines around the globe. The documents, the testimonies, the witnesses, they all painted a damning portrait of a man who had trafficked in power and lives alike. The courts would do their work. The billionaire would face the consequences of his actions, but for Aduni, the victory came at a high cost, and it had not left her without scars. She had become a symbol now, a symbol of resilience, of defiance against a system that crushed the powerless beneath its weight. People called her a hero. Her face appeared on magazine covers and in the papers. Her story was everywhere. And yet, even as the world celebrated her courage, there was no real joy in her heart. Aduni's fight had always been personal. It had been for Olamide, for the lives lost in the shadow of greed, for every woman who had ever been asked to sacrifice herself for someone else's gain. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself that she had won, she could never shake the emptiness that clung to her like a second skin. She sat in her small apartment, the dim light of the evening filtering through the curtains, and thought of her brother. She thought of the night she had given up everything to save him, only to lose him in the end. The world might have learned the truth, but there was no way to bring him back. There were no celebrations, no cheering crowds, no final moment of satisfaction, just the quiet ache of knowing that justice, while powerful, could never heal the wounds left by loss. Her phone buzzed beside her, the screen flashing Kemi's name. Aduni hadn't spoken to her since the day the story had broken. Kemi had been the one to help her expose the truth, to give her the platform to fight. But somehow it felt wrong to speak to anyone now. The world had moved on, but Aduni still felt as if she was standing in the same place, rooted in a past that would never let her go. But she picked up the phone anyway. Aduni? Kemi's voice came through, soft and gentle. How are you? It wasn't a question. It was an invitation to be heard, to share in the weight that both of them now carried. Aduni leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts tangled. I'm not sure, she admitted, her voice raw, tired. I thought this would be ... different. I thought I'd feel something. Kemi was silent for a moment, letting the weight of Aduni's words settle. It's not the victory that matters, is it? She said finally. It's the cost of it. You gave everything to expose what was wrong. But even when the world acknowledges it, there's no way to undo what was taken. Aduni closed her eyes, feeling the sting of tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed. Olamide's gone, Kemi, and nothing I do will bring him back. Justice won't erase the pain, Aduni. But it's the beginning of something. Kemi's voice held the kind of quiet strength that only someone who had seen the world turn could understand. You gave people hope. You showed them that they have a choice, that they don't have to accept a system that uses them up and spits them out. I didn't ask for hope, Aduni whispered. I just wanted my brother back. No? Kemi's voice softened, and for a moment there was nothing but silence between them two women, bound together by the weight of the world, holding on to the pieces of what they had fought for. But maybe, in some small way, what you've done will keep others from losing what you lost. Aduni sat up, wiping her face with the sleeve of her shirt. The tears were gone, replaced with something else, a kind of weary resolve. Maybe, but it's not enough. Enough for what? Que me asked. For peace, Aduni replied, her voice steady now. For Olamide's soul to rest. For the people who will never be able to speak for themselves. Justice is just a word, Kemi. It's not the end. It's just a start. Kemi was quiet for a long time. What are you going to do now? She asked finally. Aduni smiled softly, a smile that felt almost foreign to her lips. I'm going to keep fighting. For a moment, there was no response. But then Kemi said simply, Then I'll be right there with you. Aduni placed the phone down and stood up, walking to the window. The city stretched out before her, buzzing with life, each light a promise of something. There were still battles to be fought, still wrongs to be right. She had no illusions that the fight would be easy or that victory would come without cost. But she had learned that power was not in the victories alone, it was in the resistance, in the refusal to bend to the weight of the world. The storm had passed, but the work was far from over, and Aduni was ready for the next chapter. She would keep walking, not for herself, but for those who couldn't, for the brothers she had lost, and for every soul who had been buried beneath the earth of injustice, because the fight for freedom, for truth, for life, it never truly ends, and neither would she.